All right, I think we're ready to go. So thank you for joining us. This is another one in our series of webinars here at Data Holdings. We try to do one of these a month. I believe next month we're talking about ransomware. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to type them in the chat. I then get them as questions, or if it's type them in on the control panel or dashboard there. And I'll certainly make sure to go through and answer questions at the end of this presentation. My name's Ryan Brooks, and I'm with Data Holdings. We're a minority-owned data center company headquartered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We also have a backup site in Minneapolis. But most of our customers are enterprise, so we thought it would be good to have a chat about enterprise as it relates to open source. Usually there isn't much penetration of open source into enterprise, so we thought this would be an interesting topic to at least get some people talking and answer some questions for people. Again, emails there are brooks@dataholdings.com, and you're welcome to hit me up anytime you'd like to. I'm the VP and GM here, so I'm also responsible for keeping the lights on, keeping the servers cool, keeping things up. So reach out. I love talking about data centers. I love talking about open source and security and things like that. So I welcome any questions during the webinar here or afterwards. So let's start off with a bit of a definition. And you know, a lot of presentations start this way, right? That there's, you know, you start with a definition. It's a bit like a book report when you're in school, but I think in this case, it's actually warranted. So to me, open source means that you have access as a user, as someone consuming software, to the actual code and logic that is running the software in the enterprise. What it doesn't mean is that it's free or no cost. But let me start out by talking about the logic and code behind the software. So when you run software on your computer, it's executing a list of instructions. These instructions are initially written out by a human, or even these days it could be written by an AI with a human directing it. But the result is a collection of files that are describing the developer's intent. And these instructions are then either processed when the program is running or ahead of time by a compiler. But that input to that process and the output from the human is really that source code. And what open source means is, as a user of that software, you have access to that original source material that built the application. And you're also able to rebuild it yourself. You can make changes, you can make improvements. You have autonomy with your own software. And again, what it doesn't mean is that the software is free or zero cost. One point I want to get across in this presentation is that there's a cost of any type of software, regardless of license, right? You might be looking at just a proprietary piece of software that's closed source. There's a straightforward cost for the uptake of that software, delivery, and then ongoing maintenance. Whereas in open source, you might be paying for just the support piece. Or maybe you're not paying anything and you're just accumulating technical debt by not having the appropriate support structure in place to support that software. So this is expressed through software licenses. So people would point to open source, the rules behind open source being different than the rules behind proprietary or closed source software really being exhibited in that software license. I'm using the term open source, which I believe is a very inclusive definition. You know, people can get pretty religious about these sorts of things and want to use the term, well, there's another term that can be used that a lot of people prefer in the open source community, which is free software. I'm not a big fan of that terminology, although it means free in the freedom sense. It doesn't mean free as in always zero cost, and that's important to get across. So it's a bit of a marketing issue I have with the term free software. It just doesn't quite translate. And again, some people will probably frown on me using the term open source, but I feel it's the most inclusive terminology I can use today because it includes other licenses like BSD and not just things like the GPL. So In a closed source license, the developer or the company that hires the developer or hires the developers really considers that source code or the original input into the software development process to be intellectual property, and they want to protect that through copyright and patent. And really, maybe I could maybe say obfuscate the actual origin of the software. So you're buying the right to use the software, but you're certainly not buying the right to own the software or even modify the software to make it more suitable, or to have other people look at the software and do things like security audits against the software. Nor can they really decouple the support of that software from the actual software developer. So one thing that happens a lot with open source tools is that you can implement something open source. Maybe you're buying a premium license for that software that has more features than the freely available edition, and you're also paying for support, right? Maybe that support comes from a different company. There are a lot of different models, but it decouples the actual person that's producing the software from the support. Whereas in a proprietary license, you're only getting that support in many cases from the developer themselves. Again, you're locked into a cycle that's somewhat anti-competitive. So I wanted to mention some examples, some recent examples of open source and, well, not just recent, but really examples of open source that are already inside the enterprise, probably inside your enterprise. And certainly the best example of that is, that's easy to see, easy to understand, are web browsers. They all use, well, for the most part, one of two rendering engines. And when I was preparing this presentation, I was trying to think of a closed source or proprietary web browser rendering engine, or what actually puts the web content on the screen, and I can't think of one. The two big ones that are open source are WebKit and Chromium. And you have Chromium that's behind things like Chrome, Google Chrome, Microsoft Edge. WebKit's behind some Linux browsers and also Safari on the Mac and iOS. So you're using open source even to watch this presentation, including the codec that's transmitting my voice and transmitting the video of the presentation. That's all open source technology. It's things that people have agreed on. It's unencumbered by IP, and you're using it, even if it feels like it's a proprietary package, like we have here wrapped in a client for a webinar. An area that powers a lot of SaaS products, both on the proprietary side and the open source side, is the database layer of many applications. So you have proprietary technologies, things like Microsoft SQL, Oracle, the Oracle database, a lot of different Oracle server. And then you have open source alternative things like Postgres and MariaDB. All of these speak SQL. There's a lot of inertia behind the open source side, but this is a very clear space where you can draw a line between, okay, these are some proprietary solutions, and these are some open source solutions that compete. And there's support obviously available for both flavors here. Another one that's very telling is, to me, is a product by Microsoft that's completely open source, and that is Visual Studio Code. That is probably the leading code editor. It has a very rich ecosystem thanks to the open source nature of the tool. So lots of people have written plugins, supports for new languages, new architectures, new frameworks, entire orchestration environments, and published all the code. So even a company that has grown to its huge size through proprietary licenses developed something like Visual Studio Code out in the open with an open source license. They felt that the only way they would get adoption, and I agree with this, is that they open source it. Developers want things to be open source so they can all work together. And something we could also point to, right, is obviously GitHub. Although the underlying protocol remains open, and certainly people all speak Git, GitHub itself, or one of the web service offerings, was bought by Microsoft for billions of dollars, right? So a lot of the web's infrastructure, or most of the web's infrastructure, is also open source. So servers, operating systems, we hear a lot about FreeBSD and Linux serving things like Netflix, serving even Azure. You have web servers like Nginx and Apache that are open source. You have databases that we've already mentioned. Certainly any language of concern these days, things like Python are all open source. All the JavaScript frameworks that are used by developers on the client side, even server side, libraries, even some character sets are open source. Things like, there's a great example, Font Awesome is a wonderful open source or freely licensed character set and fonts. Google's contributed a bunch of common web fonts, so we're all rendering the same things on our screen. We know what to expect. So a lot of wonderful examples of open source tools that have really come into the enterprise through the back door. But the takeaway here is that everything that I think of that is a modern web-oriented architecture is probably using some amount of open source componentry and tooling to develop it, if not even deliver it. So why isn't it more popular in the enterprise, right? So this is all great open source. We're all sharing information. We're all working toward common goals. Why isn't there more uptake in the enterprise? Well, the enterprise has to be conservative by definition, right? They have to maintain uptime. They want to make conservative and sustainable decisions, and they rely on the community to tell them what to do. You're trained, and so you go to school, you're trained in certain technologies, you then go out and implement those technologies. And that gets manifested in how these technologies are sold to you. You might not, or you often won't see a traditional sales channel and certainly a marketing effort behind something like a new web server, right? You hear about, the number one web server right now is Nginx. It was purchased by F5, which we probably have heard of, but some of you have probably not heard of Nginx. And I'm not trying to call you out. I'm just trying to point out that there are a lot of really important technologies that aren't very well marketed, and because they don't have formal marketing, and no one goes out and buys Nginx. Now they might go and buy an Nginx support contract to be able to, have someone to rely on to help them run it, to deliver an application, deliver a website, but they're just not incentivized through traditional sales and marketing. The other piece here is, as you make conservative decisions that are good for your organization, business leaders are fearful of doing something different than the people that have done before. So, the famous claim that no one ever got fired for buying IBM, that probably applies to Microsoft and Intel today, but it's changing, right? There are a lot of these things, like I'm pointing out, that are just happening these days. The big irony of the no one gets fired for buying IBM, and you think, okay, that means Microsoft and Microsoft and Intel, or maybe Microsoft on AMD. IBM is the largest seller of a commercially supported Linux distribution, Red Hat, right? They contribute tons to the Linux kernel, and they don't directly get paid for that, but they do get paid to support Linux and run Linux even on some of their big iron mainframe products. Another reason that open source isn't super popular in the enterprise is that if you take some of these open source components and use them to build some new piece of software or process, you won't end up owning the intellectual property in many of the cases. Now, this depends on license. So you can do this with the BSD license. For instance, you might take if you need to produce some IoT device and you need something that you want to embed and not share the source code, you can, to a certain extent, in certain way. There are certain licenses that will help you do that, and certain licenses that won't allow you to do that. But your lawyer will tell you, hey, if I use this very, let's say, copyleft oriented operating system or GPL licensed tool, you might not end up owning the intellectual property. However, you have a bunch of people contributing to that software and making constant improvements that you can incorporate and save money by all, pointing. The rising tide raises all ships, right? And this is certainly the case here. And then the last one, IT leaders are often not aware of a particular open source tool's existence, right? So is a CFO or an IT leader even asking if there are open source alternatives to some of these tools? A great example, right? A lot of people were using SolarWinds. SolarWinds got exploited, and then a lot of networks got exploited. So what open source alternatives were there to something like the SolarWinds out there? So let's talk about the value prop behind open source. The first, and it's not the most important, but probably the most impactful aspect of open source is people can see the code. They understand the developer's intent, and they can look for mistakes. This means that security problems are avoided. You can read about this more. You have many eyes looking at the software, the code that's actually running, so you can audit it for mistakes related to security. The only way you beat hackers, or I don't want to use the term hackers, I should use the term criminals. The only way you beat them is by having more people on your side than their side, and that means having more eyes on the code. If it's one enterprise that's publishing code or using it or making some product or piece of software, and it's just their one culture looking at something, they will miss certain types of bugs. If it's open source, people will see it. It also means you understand the developer's intent and what they're doing, how they're storing things. So there's just huge security impacts by having something out there as open source and fully auditable. Also, rapid innovation, right? So the best and the brightest are working in open source. I think that's mostly undeniable. It's something where you have a lot of people all pulling the same direction, and this is where the innovation is happening. Another thing that's very important to me, it prevents lock-in. So if you load data, let's say you have a customer database and you load that into some proprietary tool and continue to work with it over year over year, add value to it. You're getting value from the tool, but you're also putting all your data in there. What happens if that company is no longer viable? What happens if you want to go a different way, or you need to integrate with something? If it's a closed source or proprietary tool, you don't have the capability necessarily to export that data in a meaningful way. If something's open source, that means the format of that data is also open source, and you ultimately have autonomy to do what you want with your own data, and you know how that data is being used because it's expressed in that code. And even if you don't understand the code, someone else is also looking at that code and looking for, hey, I have a need to export my data. Probably someone else also does, and they've published a way to export the data or convert it into another format. Again, I'm going to reemphasize the security piece. I think it's just complete FUD if someone says that proprietary is more secure than open source. This complete plague of ransomware that we've had over the past decade has been entirely due to proprietary systems. There are a lot of people in the open source community who are saying protocols like RDP and SMB, which were the vector for the first wave of ransomware, were absolute trash, and they were the reasons that places got exploited. If that had been open source, that stuff would have been fixed, or would have never even been done in the manner that it was done. So, where's you have a relationship with a proprietary company that publishes a piece of software that gets you ransomware. Where's the liability or the shared responsibility for that? I mean, that's often a piece of FUD used against open source. There isn't a responsible party. Well, where's the responsible party for ransomware, right? So, okay, bit of a soapbox there. I think also the piece here is it keeps you in a competitive situation. It keeps you in that capitalist environment where you're not single source. You're not just, oh God, here comes the contract for another year, and I've signed it again because I have lock-in. A proprietary tool has an incentive to keep you locked in and to keep things behind the curtain, so you don't know how things are working. And it's not something that I would want to latch my company onto if I could avoid it. So okay, after my soapbox, I'll go after some ways that open source isn't a panacea, right? So I would say the biggest one that prevents adoption is really the user experience, and it says a lot. I think it's really cool now that UX in itself is a profession, right? So if your organization has power users that have a ton of muscle memories in like an Office tool, something like Microsoft Office, or you have an Excel user who just, she flies over the keyboard, barely touches the mouse, and is just a complete expert, forcing them to go to something like LibreOffice or something, it's just, your users are going to revolt, and it's just not a good move. However, if it's somebody that's always like, hey, they're already using something like G Suite and they didn't really miss out on any of the more esoteric functionality of the Office tool, go for it, right? Um, then they'll probably be fine with something like LibreOffice. If they're a Photoshop or Illustrator user, some heavy Adobe user, they're probably not going to love the open source equivalents. They would be seen as a little clunky, but most importantly, they just don't have the same muscle. They just don't exploit the muscle memory that someone's gone to school for. CAD's another example of this. These are tools to people, just like using a screwdriver or a hammer, and to change how a hammer works that's just counterintuitive, and you shouldn't do that to your users. The other place it falls down are very domain-specific things. Like, I was trying to think of something for this, and something they do in the data center space is flow analysis. It's also used for aerodynamics and things like that, and heavy math, probably a bunch of IP behind it. These are expensive to develop, and you have one or two experts maybe in the world that know this stuff, know the math behind it, or just a handful anyway. Those are high cost to develop, high cost to implement, and there just hasn't been an incentive to open source those things. Will there be? I think so, eventually, but not initially. And then lastly, I already mentioned this, and that's the patent and intellectual property piece of this, right? So open source folks have a poor opinion of IP protections in general. So you're not going to see a big willingness to let somebody come in, take their work, repackage it, and sell it. And to me, that's almost an ethical thing, right? You shouldn't do that anyway. But if you're trying to build a valuation around IP specifically versus revenue or EBITDA or number of customers or something like that, maybe open source isn't for you. Now, building something that's web scale without open source, probably impossible. Even a company like Microsoft that is heavily proprietary and has a very amazing public cloud offering through Azure uses a ton of open source. So I don't think it would be, I don't know anyone doing web scale that is doing completely proprietary. So yeah, so those are some places, just again, where open source isn't the end all be all. That all being said, there have been some absolutely wonderful open source wins, and I think that it's really driven a lot of the economic growth across the globe. Certainly the internet, the core protocols are unencumbered by IP, and everything's just published out there. Where we've run into problems are very strange areas, like if you want to read more about this, things like Rambus or even some of the codecs used for video. And someone who wants to capture intellectual property will come into an open standards process, zoom in and copyright things or patent or somehow protect some piece of IP that was developed in an open fashion. But for the most part, everything that's important on the internet is completely open. And, there was a time when there were competing technologies, competing not only with TCP IP as the core protocol, but even commercial public networks that were competing against the internet. Well, the internet won for a reason, right? Servers, I think, certainly public facing and web scale and web oriented architectures have completely been won over by open source operating systems. We're probably streaming this on a cluster of Linux servers that's hosted in the cloud somewhere. We don't even know. We don't care that they're Linux, but it's something that's been highly optimized, and you have just the best and brightest working on it. If you're at home streaming Netflix, you're probably using FreeBSD. Web, I've talked a lot about that. Everything on the web, every important web server, web protocol is all open source. Companies like Google were really built because of that, right? Security, I've talked about that. I think security has actually improved. Things could actually be worse, believe it or not, if we didn't have open source and everyone, pulling the same direction to improve security. I think zero trust has come out of that. And that's really the realization that, there's no border to your network. You have work at home users, or even a user that's internal could be as big a threat going rogue or even doing something inadvertent our biggest threat is someone external, just some random person on the internet. So these web concepts and open source really push that. I think Google's done a lot in this regard to make us think about things. Hey, whether I'm an employee or an external person, if anything, the internal person is a greater risk to the organization. So open source technology helps a lot with that. When things are worked on in the light, with everyone working together in an open fashion. Development, the practice of software development, software engineering has completely matured as a result of open source and everyone working together. Git has done a lot with that. GitHub was purchased by Microsoft, and that's a big collaboration tool. One collaboration tool for users of Git to go out and share things, publish things, work on things together. That was worth billions of dollars for Microsoft just to have the platform. But the protocol itself and the code is open. It's open source and can be used by anybody. There's competitors to GitHub, but certainly any language of importance. As we get into data and AI, all the libraries, the language itself, everything that's being used for AI has been very, very open. So that's why you've seen this tremendous growth. And again, just the internet aspect really helping the collaboration. So not only did the open source nature of the internet from day one help it grow, but it produced a sort of snowball effect or a virtuous cycle by the people contributing to open source helped the internet and the applications on the internet improve, and that made the internet improve faster and built the web, and then everything on top of that. So I just think, as a company, as an enterprise company adopts things like AI, they start caring more and more about their data. They care more and more about their security. It's just open source is already in the enterprise. Recognize it, find ways to exploit it, so you either exceed or at least keep up with your competitors. And ask people, hey, if I'm adopting something proprietary, what are the alternatives out there? So that's the end of my presentation. So give open source a chance, and let me go and look for some questions here. One moment. Can you use open source for commercial purposes is the first one I have here. So good question. Yes, you can absolutely use it for commercial purposes. You can read the different licenses. If you Google, I would say type in something into Google or your favorite search engine, something like GPL versus BSD versus MIT, and that'll give you an idea about how you can use it. So there have been concerns about using open source and how it's used in SaaS applications, where obviously you could take a bunch of open source tools, use them to build a service, and never really expose that service never expose those tools back to the user. So it sort of was a bit of a bypass on the spirit of open source, where we're taking a bunch of collaborative work, putting it behind a SaaS offering, and then you don't get to see the code, but it somehow remains open source. So there's been some change. There's been a newer GPL license to address that, but certainly yes, you can use it for commercial purposes, whether you're just a user or you're contributing to the code. It will have IP implications, and you can read more about that as well. So another question here is there a good source where I can learn more about open source software and find programs that could help my company? Yeah, there's an interesting site, and this will tell you open source and proprietary, just to keep it on an even playing field, and that is alternatives to. So if you type in something like in a search engine, alternative to whatever tool, and it will tell you both open source and proprietary solutions selected. We use a very interesting marketing automation tool called Mautic, and that's an open source tool that we really like, and that's very enterprisey. I'd encourage you to check it out. It's something that you might normally think of as a SaaS thing. We self-host it, and it's very powerful. But you could go type alternative to whatever your tool is, and it'll print things out, or print things out. It'll show you things, alternatives to both, good proprietary things, see what other people are using. GitHub's good. GitLab is good for this as well. But certainly a search engine is your friend in this regard. What do you think is the low-hanging fruit for enterprises when it comes to open source? Network monitoring. I think is something that has kind of gone SaaS. I really am to expose your entire network to the cloud seems like a big risk to me. So I would encourage enterprises to still, if they have a network, to monitor that themselves, self-hosting. There's a lot of nice solutions for that. I don't have a favorite, but look at something like, one thing that's very interesting to me is the NetFlow protocol, which allows you to share metadata about or about you to to take metadata and about network flows, and then make networking decisions based on that. Uh, Data, everything data. If you're developing something, you should build it on open source tools, absolutely. So if you have someone coming in as a programmer, they should be doing something in some very open language that there's a lot of inertia around. So if you ever have to hire more people or get different people, there's a rich ecosystem around that. So certainly going after languages like Python is very interesting. Go is interesting. Rust is interesting for the memory safety aspect. So there's a lot of, I wouldn't go with, I wouldn't invest, although Java is interesting, I wouldn't probably invest in Java these days. There's some interesting other languages than Java that run on the JVM, but yeah. If your users are interested, oh, I know. There's an interesting tool called Nextcloud, which allows you to sort of bring some of these cloud services internally, including things like file sharing, calendaring, wiki. That is something. Ticketing can be brought in-house. I think if you're taking some piece of data and giving it over to a proprietary system, that's where you got to look. Something that's a tier one application. Are there alternatives that will provide real autonomy, keep me out of anti-competitive situations going forward? Those are places to look for open source. Places where you might need to customize something, take something off the shelf that's a bunch of people are already working on, and work on it with them. Even if you're not a developer, there's probably a way to get engaged, or maybe your organization, it's less expensive to hire a developer that could participate in one of these things. And then again, a rising tide, right? Let's see if there's anything else. Well, I think that's it. So I think, again, next month we're going to talk about ransomware. I got off on a bit of a soapbox about that today, but we'll talk more about it and what is going on today with ransomware. But again, my email is rbrooks@dataholdings.com. Thanks for listening to me today, and see you next month.